Hello, Brobs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story. Roberta Roche with Harry de la Roche Jr. It's about the murder of the Harry de la Roche family by their son, Jr. Chapter 2. Exactly 18 years, 2 months, and 5 days before Harry was led into Bergen County Jail, a 5-story fortress-like building that looks like a medieval dungeon. He was born Harry William Frederick de la Roche Jr., later shortened to Hatchie. The date was September 23rd, 1958, and the place was Englewood, New Jersey Hospital. He was 3.5 months premature, and since his mother's pregnancy had been threatened with miscarriages, he wasn't expected to be born alive. But Harry survived his early birth and eventually went home to Lodi, an industrial melting pot borough, when he was christened with his father's full name. Steve Madrepola, his father's boyhood friend, became his godfather and Uncle Steve. Harry's first home was on Avenue F, a few doors from the Ebneater's house. Then after 6 years at that address, he moved with his family to Montvale and settled in the Grand Avenue home. Though Harry was too young to know it, prior to the move to Montvale, the paternal and maternal sides of his family were an intricate study in contrast. In fact, as far back as 3 generations, the seeds of family conflicts began a slow growth into tangled roots. On the maternal side, Harry's great-grandfather, George Bronson Howard, had been a weaver of stories. He was a playwright and playboy, and at various times he lived in Paris, Nice, London, Baltimore, and New York. He traveled with the theatrical crowd, and the family liked to tell stories of how he'd come home from parties and jump into the shower while wearing his top hat and tails. By the time George Bronson Howard was 21, he was writing magazine stories about a secret agent for the State Department. This was a new type of hero for the early 1900s. Later, he expanded to romance, essays, plays, criticism, and musical reviews. He was a vaudeville impresario in Paris and a librettist for the Winter Garden in New York. 2 of his plays were in collaboration with Booth Tarkington and David Belasco, and his most famous work, The Red Light of Mars, was published in 1913. Friends who remember him recall that he was also connected with the original Follies, Bergère. Harry's maternal grandmother, Margaret, was George Bronson Howard's daughter. While she was growing up, George Bronson Howard separated from his wife, and at the time of the separation, Margaret's mother, Margaret Horan Howard, and her brother George moved to Edgewater, New Jersey, to live in an artist's colony along the Hudson River. Margaret stayed with her eccentric father and lived in Greenwich Village, where he gave her a fine education. They spent many hours together reading the classics and poetry aloud, and because the 2 of them were so close, Margaret absorbed many of his ways and took on theatrical mannerisms she never really lost. Occasionally, Margaret stayed with her mother in Edgewater, and on one of her visits she met Ronald Francis Greer, son of John William Greer and Mary Jane McGrath Greer. Both were highly respected and well-liked in town, but when Margaret and Ronald fell in love, there was much discord about it. Edgewater, an old-fashioned town at the time, was critical of outsiders, and George Bronson Howard, with his cosmopolitan background, was disturbed by his daughter's small-town romance. When she married Ronald Greer, her father ultimately disowned her because, according to his terms, she'd married beneath her status. Margaret was a showstopper in Edgewater, and in later years, she liked to tell the story of how she shocked the old-timers when she showed up at the Edgewater ball dressed in a form-fitting harlequin outfit with a black swagger stick. Eventually, she was accepted in town, and while her husband worked as a traffic manager and indulged in ponies and in booze on the side, she stayed home and raised 3 children, 2 sons, Ronald and John, and a daughter, Mary Jane. Ronald, the oldest, served in the Air Force during World War II and was killed while in the Pacific. John was 13 years younger than Mary Jane. Mary Jane, a real Titian beauty, grew up to be photogenic. Her first career choice after graduating from Dwight Morrow High School in 1943 was fashion design, since she was an excellent seamstress. But because of her striking long red hair, she became a model, then switched to a job teaching sewing in a West New York Singer sewing machine shop. On the paternal side of the family, Joanna Abneater, or Honey, was Harry's true blood grandmother. But Ernie was not his blood grandfather, though Harry didn't know this in his early years. Later, when he was old enough, his mother told him his father was an illegitimate child and that Honey had raised Harry Sr. until she married Ernie when Harry Sr. was 14 or 15. Honey's maiden name was De La Roche, so Harry Sr. took that surname. As for the rest of his lengthy name, Harry was for his real father. William was for his real father. William was for his grandmother, Wilhelmina Strudel de la Roche, and Frederick was for his grandfather, Frederick de la Roche. Wilhelmina, better known as Graham, often took care of Harry Sr. when Honey had to work, and both of the women in the fatherless home took pride in Harry Sr. and would do anything for him. They couldn't protect him, however, from the taunts he got because he had no father, and some made it a point to mock him and call him a bastard. Occasionally, he'd carry a knife in order to protect himself. In stark contrast to the taunting was his friendship with Steve. I need to really get a handle on this one. Madreperla, an all-around student and athlete. After graduation from Rhode Island University, Steve started what became a successful career in the fire protection industry. He was also a deacon in the church he and his family attended, and since Steve had a father who had been extremely strict, some people believe that Harry Sr. felt that strictness played a part in his friend's success. He wanted success for his sons, too. So he may have patterned his role as a father on what he thought had started Steve on the right track in life. Let's go back and look at some pictures. Young Harry Jr. Harry with his uncle John Greer on Easter, April 17, 1960 in Montvale. Harry Jr. with grandmother Greer in Montvale. And then here's Harry De La Roche Jr. at the Inglewood Hospital, October 1958. Here I am at last. I was born Tuesday. Honey Abneater had two brothers, Chris, who lived in Weehawken, and John, who resided in Union City. Chris lived close to Honey and had children around Harry Sr.'s age. But Harry Sr. never went to their house, either because he had been told he wouldn't be welcome as an illegitimate child, or because he felt he'd receive that reception if he appeared at the door. Steve Madreperla played there, however, and was a good friend of the family, and Steve recalls that on one occasion, when Harry Sr. was 12, he cautiously approached that house for the first time in his life. From that day on, he and Harry Sr. began their lifetime friendship. But Steve was aware and has sometimes said that Harry Sr. grew up with much hurt, and because he had no father, had a special need to be very strong and secure. Following Harry Sr.'s graduation from Weehawken High School in 1950, he worked in a factory that manufactured Christmas tree balls. Then in 1952, he enlisted in the Navy and served on the destroyer the Douglas H. Fox. During the Korean War, when he returned to civilian life after 4 years, he took a job in West New York as a serviceman for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. On that job, he met Mary Jane, who was then working for that company. Before they married in 1958, Harry Sr. switched to his first job with Ford. The year they were married, he was 23 and Mary Jane had just turned 30. In the 50s, that was getting on when a girl wasn't married. History seemed to repeat itself, too, because the Greer family as a whole did not take to Harry Sr. Mary Jane's father particularly opposed him and tried to prevent the marriage by telling his daughter again and again, "There's something about that man. I won't attend your wedding," he warned, "if you marry Harry de la Roche." Margaret Greer interceded, though, and when she saw the marriage was on, regardless of the family's feelings, she insisted that their daughter be escorted down the aisle and have the wedding she wanted. After a storybook wedding, on the surface, at least, Harry Sr. and Mary Jane honeymooned in Niagara Falls before settling down in the little house on Avenue F in Lodi. Soon, Mary Jane discovered she was pregnant with Harry Jr. 6 years later, the De La Roches, now a family of 5, made the move to Montvale, prompted by the fact that Margaret Greer, the owner of the Montvale house, was now a widow who needed someone to live with her. When she'd first moved to Montvale from Edgewater, her son John, who works in field engineering for General Electric, lived with her and supported the household. Later, he married Arden Molly, and they moved into their own apartment. But he still helped his father financially, and together he and Arden did what they could for her. Arden, a graduate of Green Mountain Junior College, was a slight, petite, attractive woman with wavy brown hair that came to her shoulders. She worked as a bookkeeper in the area and ran many errands for Margaret. John was tall, with short, cut hair and a casual, fun-loving manner, but both Greers had a serious side and a real concern for people. In fact, when they'd been married a while and were settled in a house, they took teenagers from broken homes into their home in Maywood. Although the Greers did all they could to take care of Margaret, she eventually needed someone to live in her house with her, not only because of money, but because she had several health problems that required many medications. Since she needed this kind of help, and her daughter Mary Jane and her family needed more space, the maternal side of the family got together and planned that Harry Sr. and Mary Jane would sell their Lodi home and move to Montvale to help take care of Margaret and to assume full charge of the house. A financial arrangement was drawn up, making Margaret and De La Roche joint tenants of the house, and specifying that on Margaret's death, the house would go to Harry Sr. and Mary Jane. The move to Montvale was a step up the ladder from living in industrial Lodi, and Harry Sr.'s initial expenditure was turning it into a two-family dwelling, so his family and Margaret would both have privacy. To give his mother-in-law privacy, Harry Sr. was more than anxious to turn the living room and the den to the left of the front entrance into a two-room apartment for Margaret. He also put in a tiny bath. Usually Margaret cooked for herself on a hot plate in her room. The kitchen was part of the De La Roche quarters, and Mary Jane made the dining room the family's living room. Because she was so good at sewing, Mary Jane decorated the house with chintz. She also furnished the De La Roche's quarters with braided rugs, books, plants, and flowers, and lots of photographs. Since the dining room had no fireplace, she went out and bought a fake one and placed her wedding painting above it. As soon as the boys grew older, the family filled the basement with toys, a pool table, and trains. And while the boys played there for hours, no one anticipated the horrible discovery that basement would someday reveal. Just as my old rickety chair is revealing the cracks of age. Is that a good sound or awful sound? I don't listen to these recordings, so I wouldn't know. All right, that's all. Back next time with chapter 3. Goodbye, bruv.